They didn't store food in panic, they stored it in silence. During the war, survival wasn't broadcast, it was hidden in walls, under floors, inside ash barrels and firewood piles. These families weren't hoarders, they were protectors of calories, of dignity, of the next meal in a world that promised nothing. Every hidden jar, every hollow log, every sealed crate wasn't just strategy, it was defiance against scarcity, against loss, against offumentum surrenderhi, modern prepping talks in terms of of shelf life and bug-out bags. But these people didn't have checklists. They had instinct, sharpened by necessity, passed down through generations, and buried under the weight of forgetting. What they built wasn't convenient, it was continuity. And most of it is gone, unless we choose to relearn it. Because when the systems fail, and one day they will, it won't be the flashy gadgets or vacuum-sealed kits that hold the line. It will be the quiet knowledge our grandparents trusted. The tricks that kept them fed when every store was shuttered and every option was gone. If you believe those methods still matter, if you think survival should never depend on luck, then don't just watch. Subscribe. Honor what they endured. Reclaim what they knew. And rebuild the skills that kept them, and us, alive. Number 1. False floorboards in bedrooms. Under the boots of patrolling soldiers, safety once lay in the creak of familiar floorboards. In occupied homes from Holland to Hungary, when the knock came or boots thundered up staircases, food didn't vanish. It sank into the floor itself. Bedrooms, often spared from initial searches, became strategic defense points. Beneath worn rugs and dusty bed frames, families quietly pried up planks. These weren't trap doors. They were lifelines. Carefully lifted using thin tools or bent nails, a single board revealed cavities carved by hand, just deep enough to cradle sealed jars, wax-wrapped bread, or cloth bundles of dried fruit. Sometimes an entire mattress would rest above a family's last meal. The method was deceptively simple, but its power lay in discipline. Floorboards were chosen not for ease, but for obscurity. Those beneath heavy furniture, those that blended with warped wood. Even children were trained to step lightly. Nails were numbered. Dust was replaced exactly. Anything less, and the illusion cracked. In parts of Belgium, some families reinforced their boards with new slats, masking old seams. Others added squeaks to neighboring planks, drawing attention away from the silent ones. These decisions weren't made in panic. They were rehearsed, season after season. This method also fought moisture. In damp zones, hidden food was first wrapped in waxed linen or stored in tin canisters lined with paper ash. Every detail mattered. How deep, how sealed, how silent. A single lapse could mean confiscation, or worse. Yet, across thousands of homes, this technique endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it worked often enough to keep a family from starving. During especially harsh winters, one floor cavity might hold enough to stretch meals for an extra 2 weeks. There were limits. Floorboard caches couldn't store bulk items like barrels or crates. And, in homes already damaged by shelling or looting, floor concealment wasn't always an option. But in stable buildings, this hiding spot became sacred. Not just storage, but defiance beneath one's feet. This wasn't cleverness. It was cold calculation under threat. One board, one gap, 1 inch of silence between survival and surrender. Would you trust your next meal to a plank of wood? If you would have tried this, save this method and follow for the rest. Number 2. Inside hollowed furniture legs. When surveillance intensified and footlockers were pried open first, civilians turned to the last place anyone would think to check: the legs of their own furniture. In homes under constant threat, from France's back alleys to Bulgaria's quiet villages, ordinary chairs, tables, and wardrobes became covert storage vaults. It wasn't artistry, it was a necessity. Families began hollowing out thick wooden legs, carefully boring cylindrical cavities with hand tools late at night. These spaces weren't large, often no wider than a thumb, no deeper than a soup spoon, but they were dry, concealed, and above suspicion. Dried herbs, bouillon cubes, salt tablets, seeds, or even matchbooks were wrapped in oiled paper or linen, then slid inside. The openings were sealed with wax, wooden plugs, or mud, blended with dust to match the wood grain. Once dried and rubbed down, the plug vanished. Even sharp-eyed soldiers never looked twice. This method wasn't for bulk calories, it was for edge-of-starvation essentials. In one Czech household, a grandmother stored enough dried nettles and beef concentrate in a table leg to make weak broth for 2 weeks. In Denmark, beeswax-wrapped yeast cultures were hidden inside a bed frame and used for months to make underground bread. The furniture wasn't moved, it wasn't sold, it was sacred, because it held the line between hunger and endurance. The strength of this technique lay in its invisibility. Searchers flipped mattresses, cut wallpaper, and smashed floorboards, but almost never disassembled chairs. Soldiers were trained to look for compartments. They weren't trained to question weight distribution. Still, it had limits. Moisture could seep in. Items stored had to be bone dry. And if the furniture was ever damaged or confiscated, everything was lost. But families who relied on this method didn't use it for convenience. They used it for last reserves. Food not meant to be touched unless everything else was gone. This wasn't creative hiding. It was a response to systematic deprivation. It was what happens when people are hunted not for what they did, but for what they kept. Would you have thought to hollow a table leg? Save this trick. It's still protecting families in silent places today. Number 3. Beneath hearthstones and kitchen bricks. In wartime homes across Europe, the kitchen was often the warmest room, and the most watched. Soldiers knew rations were hidden near ovens and chimneys, so they searched shelves, pried open cupboards, and even scattered firewood. But what many failed to consider was what lay directly beneath their boots. Families in regions like southern Poland and rural Italy began lifting the stones beneath their hearths. These were heavy blocks, part of the floor, often blackened by soot or worn smooth by decades of use. Underneath, a shallow cavity could be carved, just deep enough to store flat goods, tin containers, oiled paper packages, dried roots, or powdered milk wrapped in cloth. To reach the space, one stone had to be pried loose. Not broken, removed cleanly. This required quiet, patience, and timing. Families used simple levers, made from broken tools or kitchen knives. Once the goods were placed inside, the stone was repositioned exactly, the edges dusted with ash or swept clean to mask any disturbance. Soldiers rarely noticed, even when standing directly on top of it. This technique thrived because it exploited a blind spot, the assumption that concealment was vertical, up in attics, hidden in ceilings, or behind paintings. But the hearth was sacred, domestic, and ancient. No one wanted to admit food might be beneath it. It was also hot and soot-covered, hardly the place to search with bare hands. Items chosen for this hiding spot had to be heat-resistant and long-lasting. Dried onions, bouillon cubes, thick salami wrapped in wax, or packets of medicinal herbs. In Greek villages, it was common to store whole heads of garlic under hearthstones to prevent mold. In Croatia, families hid rye flour in sealed tins, knowing it could last the winter if the top stayed cool. But it wasn't perfect. The method only worked in homes with stone floors or brick kitchens, not in wooden cabins or mud dwellings, and lifting the stone too often risked exposure. Still, the hearthstone method was widespread because it used tradition as camouflage. In a world where trust was rare and storage meant survival, the place where meals were once prepared became the very place that ensured they could still exist. Would you remember to look beneath your own feet? Hit save. This isn't just history. It's a method still hiding in plain sight. Number 4. For inside hollowed-out firewood logs. During World War II, fireplaces and stoves were central, both for warmth and cooking. Piles of firewood were stacked openly, often just outside the home or near the kitchen. And because they looked ordinary, they became invisible. That's exactly why some families across Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and rural France turned logs into hiding places. They hollowed them out, using hand tools, chisels, small saws, even heated rods. Families would bore out the center of thick logs, especially larger ones meant to burn slowly. These cavities were just wide enough to fit cloth-wrapped dry goods, small jars of lard, tins of meat, or even bundled currency, and salt pouches. Once packed, the ends were plugged with wooden discs or sealed with mud, then camouflaged with dirt, bark dust, or soot to match the surrounding logs. When stacked among dozens of others, the hidden log was indistinguishable. This technique worked for two reasons. First, it weaponized normalcy. Firewood was everywhere. It wasn't suspicious. Soldiers didn't want to get their hands dirty picking through heaps of splinters and soot when more obvious targets, cupboards, drawers, or cellars, seemed likely. Second, it protected the goods inside from temperature swings, pests, and light. In cold climates like Finland and parts of Austria, the insulation of thick logs kept contents stable, even edible through winter. This wasn't just theory. Families in Slovakia used the method to hide dried fruit. In Lithuania, hollow logs stored ration cards or letters. In the Netherlands, when salt was restricted and taxed, black market traders delivered it in firewood cores, passed off as nothing more than seasoned oak. Women would receive the logs, split them in private, and recover wrapped bundles tucked safely inside. But the method had limits. Hollowing a log took time and silence. You couldn't hammer or saw at night without alerting neighbors or patrols. If done poorly, the log would split unevenly, revealing its hollow center. If burned by mistake, everything inside was lost. Some families marked the ends with faint scratches or wrapped a specific cord around one log to identify it later. Despite the risks, the hollow log method gave families a chance to hide vital supplies in the open. It turned fuel into concealment. It used the mundane to protect the essential. And today, it's a reminder. The best hiding places are often those no one wants to touch. Would you ever think to look inside a log? Save this method. One day, it might keep you warm and fed. Number 5. Beneath chicken coops and animal pens. In rural areas during World War II, soldiers often scoured barns, pantries, and cellars looking for hidden stockpiles. But few wanted to crawl beneath chicken coops. Fewer still bothered with pig pens or goat sheds. That's where civilians gained an edge, by turning filth into cover. Families began hiding supplies directly under livestock enclosures. It wasn't just clever, it was effective. Animals provided natural deterrence. Feathers, filth, strong odors. These spaces were dirty, cramped, and avoided by most occupying forces. Civilians exploited that reluctance. In Poland and Romania, farmers dug shallow pits beneath chicken wire and floorboards where hens roamed freely. The spaces were just deep enough to stash clay jars of fat, dried beans, or sealed flour sacks. They reinforced the ground with wooden planks or slate, then covered the boards with packed earth and hay. The chickens, scratching and pecking all day, became living security, covering any disturbance with noise and movement. Some families went further. They buried smoked meat in wax cloth beneath goat pens, trusting the animal's scent and mess to deter snooping. In Hungary, reports from resistance networks mention caches of black market salt and sugar hidden beneath duck enclosures. These were waterproofed in metal tins or lined baskets, then buried where droppings and mud masked any hint of tampering. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The advantages were clear. The smell discouraged dogs, the noise masked digging, and the risk of disease kept searchers away. Even if soldiers suspected something, few were willing to tear apart a foul-smelling pen just to find a jar of beans. But there were drawbacks. First, hygiene. If storage wasn't airtight, contamination ruined everything. Families had to wrap goods meticulously, using wax paper, oilcloth, or tar-sealed lids. Second, waterlogging. Heavy rains turned coops into mud traps. Without elevated boards or drainage ditches, entire caches could rot. Some families lost food not to theft, but to mold and collapse. Still, many kept using the method year after year because it was discreet, repeatable, and accessible. A woman in northern France survived 2 winters by rotating jars of fat beneath her henhouse, retrieving one every few weeks when supplies ran low. She called it the pantry that no soldier would touch, and that's the essence of this technique. It turned disgust into protection. It used life, loud, messy, unavoidable life, to shield what mattered most. Would you ever hide food under livestock? Comment if you'd use this forgotten trick, or share your own method of invisible storage. Number 6. Hollowed out firewood stacks. In the forests of occupied Europe, firewood was more than just fuel. It was camouflage. When soldiers marched through rural zones looking for supplies, they saw wood piles as essential, but mundane. Something to burn, not something to search for. That was the advantage. Civilians started carving out space inside their wood. They hollowed thick logs, removed the core, and used the empty space to store everything from dried beans to rolled currency. The opening was sealed with a snug-fitting plug, made from the same wood, nearly invisible once returned to the pile. These disguised storage logs were mixed into larger stacks beside stoves or sheds. To any outsider, they were ordinary firewood, rough, splintered, stained by the elements. But to the family who placed them there, they were lifelines. In Ukraine and eastern Slovakia, some communities created entire decoy wood piles. Outward-facing logs were untouched. But at the core, several had been hollowed and stuffed with wrapped food, letters, even stolen ration cards. Families rotated them seasonally, never leaving the same piece too long in case someone decided to light it. Even more clever, some didn't hollow the logs at all. Instead, they built crates shaped and stacked like logs. These crates had wooden slats on all visible sides, but opened at the rear or top. From the outside, they looked identical to the rest of the stack. But inside, flour, salt, biscuits, sewing needles, anything that could survive without refrigeration and might one day disappear from stores. The method wasn't foolproof. Rain could seep into poorly sealed logs. Insect damage, rot, or even a desperate neighbor could undo months of careful work. And once winter hit, the temptation to burn stored logs became dangerously high. But the technique offered one key advantage: invisibility in plain sight. No one suspected firewood. Not when it sat outside for months. Not when it was rough-cut and unassuming, and certainly not when it looked identical to the hundreds of cords stacked across the region. The logs didn't just hide food, they hid defiance. They were quiet acts of rebellion against control, against confiscation, against surrender. Would you trust your supplies inside your firewood, or is this a trick best left to memory? Tap save if you try this, and hit subscribe if you want to see more hidden techniques like this one. Number 7. Beneath chicken coops. In rural wartime homesteads, every animal had a purpose. But some served double duty. The family chickens didn't just provide eggs, they guarded secrets. Beneath their coops, families built hidden compartments to store preserved food, small valuables, or rationed goods they couldn't afford to lose. Why a chicken coop? Because no one wanted to crawl under it. These shelters were filthy, foul-smelling, and swarming with feathers and droppings. Soldiers and informants, even looters, avoided them instinctively. That gave civilians one of the few places no one wanted to check. The construction varied. Some families dug shallow pits beneath the wooden floors of the coop and placed sealed tins, wax-covered jars, or fabric-wrapped bundles inside. The floorboards were nailed down loosely or made to lift on hinges. Others reinforced the floor with stone slabs or bricks to create a more stable chamber, lined with straw or ash to prevent moisture buildup. Everything was placed in waterproof containers, often wrapped again in oilcloth or animal hide, just to be sure, and it wasn't spacious, and it wasn't pleasant. But it worked. In parts of Hungary and Romania, it was common for families to hide fermented cabbage, lard, cured meats, or even salt under these makeshift vaults. The heat from the animals above helped regulate the temperature below, keeping it stable through harsh seasons. But the true protection came from psychology. No occupying force wanted to reach into filth. No officer wanted to overturn clucking birds or crawl into a dark, stinking crawl space just to check for food. The smell acted as a barrier. The noise of disturbed hens created cover. The dirt and feathers masked signs of recent digging. Of course, the method had limits. Rats could sniff out weak seals. Flooding could ruin everything if drainage wasn't precise. And if the birds were stolen or slaughtered, the whole system collapsed. But for families with nowhere else to turn, it was one of the few hiding spots that used disgust as a defense. The coop didn't just shelter birds, it sheltered survival. Tucked beneath the claws and cackles of a flock no one dared disturb. Would you try hiding your supplies under your livestock? Or does this technique belong to a different time? Comment World War II smart if you think this method still holds up, and subscribe if you're learning something new. Number 8. Inside hollowed firewood. When survival depends on secrecy, even firewood becomes a weapon of misdirection. During WWII, families across Central and Eastern Europe developed a technique so simple, so overlooked, that it often fooled even the most thorough inspections: hollowing out logs. At first glance, the firewood pile was nothing more than a stack of chopped fuel. Dry, splintered, and unremarkable. But within some of those logs, civilians had carved narrow chambers, just wide enough to hold dried beans, lard, wax-sealed documents, or rolled sacks of grain. Once filled, the ends of the logs were sealed with plugs cut from the same wood, glued or tamped into place with ash and resin to mask any disturbance. It wasn't about space, it was about invisibility. The brilliance lay in the assumption. Soldiers often raided food stores and pantries, but rarely firewood piles. Fuel was too common, too mundane, and unless they were desperate for heat, few would waste time or energy splitting each log open to investigate. This trick bought time, sometimes weeks, sometimes seasons. In parts of Slovenia and the Czech countryside, it became a quiet standard, especially in winters when supplies ran low and confiscation was routine. One log might contain a week's worth of dried oats, another a small tin of lard that could flavor an entire month's meals. For families with children or elders, these were lifelines disguised as kindling. But there were dangers. If the wrong log ended up in the stove, a meal could vanish in smoke. If inspectors grew suspicious and chopped randomly, the illusion failed. That's why logs were often buried deep within stacks or marked subtly. A knot here, a nick there, only recognizable to those who placed them. This wasn't just storage, it was camouflage in plain sight. Ever think your woodpile could save your life? If yes, hit like. You've just uncovered another forgotten trick from a time when every ember held a secret. They didn't store food in panic, they stored it in silence. During the war, survival wasn't broadcast. It was hidden. In walls, under floors, inside ash barrels, and firewood piles. These families weren't hoarders. They were protectors of calories, of dignity, of the next meal in a world that promised nothing. Every hidden jar, every hollow log, every sealed crate wasn't just strategy. It was defiance. Against scarcity, against onso loss, against to surrender. Modern prepping talks in terms of shelf life and bug-out bags, but these people didn't have checklists. They had instinct, sharpened by necessity, passed down through generations and buried under the weight of forgetting. What they built wasn't convenient. It was continuity, and most of it is gone, unless we choose to relearn it. Because when the systems fail, and one day they will, it won't be the flashy gadgets or vacuum-sealed kits that hold the line. It will be the quiet knowledge our grandparents trusted, the tricks that kept them fed when every store was shuttered and every option was gone. If you believe those methods still matter, if you think survival should never depend on luck, then don't just watch. Subscribe. Honor what they endured. Reclaim what they knew. and rebuild the skills that kept them and us alive.